Hello there. We're going to be talking about buying a car or a vehicle versus leasing. So this is oftentimes a huge topic of debate, and there's some people who say you should never lease, and there's some people who say you should always lease. And I guess the answer is, as with most financial decisions of, well, it depends. So let's talk about some of the considerations that you should make. First, we're going to contrast traditional financed loans to a lease. So on traditional financing, the way that it works is you have your vehicle and you're going to pay it down from point A. Let's say that it's a $40,000 vehicle. You're going to pay it down from point A to point B, and point B in this scenario is going to be $0. So you're going to make all these payments along the way, so on and so forth. As you can see, I went to art school and I'm a beautiful artist and it's wonderful. Not really. So you make all these payments, paying it off, getting down to zero. That's a traditional loan. Should be pretty straightforward. I don't think I've lost anyone there. So let's talk about the difference on a lease. So what you're doing here is you've got point A, but we're actually going to add in a middle section here for point B and then point C. So on a lease, really what you do is you have an additional option here with your financing. Now, not everyone qualifies for a lease. It's not always a good fit, but some of the benefits of a lease is that generally if you're a business owner, you can usually write off 100% of the lease. And so that can be a really nice aspect if you've got a business that you have. So it's kind of cool. Whereas with a traditional loan, you can't always write off 100% of it. Sometimes you're taking mileage, sometimes you're taking the other factors. So with a lease, usually you can write off the whole amount. So kind of cool. So with a lease, what are you doing? You're basically paying the car from point A to point B, and then at point B you have some options. So you're making your payments, and point A, we're going to use that same $40,000 example, and then we're going to say $20,000. Now it's not exactly half of the vehicle's value. Most leases are actually a little bit less than half, to where maybe it's going to be $25,000 that you're paying it down to, or what have you. But we're still going to have $0 over there. So a lease, all you're doing here is that rather than paying it from A all the way to C, from $40,000 to 0, you're going to pay it from $40,000 down to $20,000. And you have some options here at the $20,000 mark, or the halfway mark of paying the vehicle down. So it's kind of cool. So what are those options? Well, the first option is not every lease has this, so I'm bringing it up right off the bat. A lot of leases do. More and more leases nowadays have this, but some leasing companies don't allow it. Some places, I know that for a while, and maybe Toyota and Honda have changed, but for a while they wouldn't let you buy out your vehicle. So option A is to be able to buy it out. Let's say that you love the car, it's exactly what you want to have it forever, then you buy it out for $20,000, and maybe you get a loan to buy it out, or maybe you pay cash for it, whatever. You buy it out for that residual amount. That's one of the terms that you need to get familiar with, is the residual is that halfway point. So you can buy it out. Option 2 is that you can trade it in. So generally you're actually buying it out and then trading in. So it's two separate transactions kind of in the same breath. But you trade it in, and why would you want to trade it in? Well, maybe you've got equity in this vehicle. Maybe you can buy it out for 20, but the market value or the trade-in value is actually 24 or 25. In that situation, why wouldn't you capture some of that equity and throw it into another vehicle? Maybe you're throwing it into another used vehicle, or maybe you're throwing it into another lease or a new vehicle, whatever the case may be, but you can trade it in and capture your equity. Now, what happens if you don't have equity? Well, that's the beauty of a lease, and most of the time this is all people know about, is that you can walk away from a lease, or you can give it back to the leasing company. So this is the option that I think is super powerful for people, and why it makes sense for many people to actually lease their vehicles instead of buy them. If you can get into a lease and it's the right fit and the right vehicle and everything like that, if everything works out for you to get into a lease, I usually tell people to get into a lease rather than buying a car that's a few years old or rather than buying traditional finance on a new car. Now, it doesn't always make sense, but when it does, do it. Why would you want to have the option to be able to walk away on a lease? Well, let's say that you've made all these payments and we get to this point and you can buy out the car for $20,000, but maybe the car's now, rather instead of being worth $24,000, $25,000, let's say that the market's gone soft on it and the car's only worth $15,000. So if you're in a negative equity position, why would you want to buy it out? Why would you want to trade it in? Because then you're going to be rolling that negative equity into your next car. There's far too many people who do that. They roll negative equity to negative equity to negative equity, going from vehicle to vehicle to vehicle, and it's a stupid financial practice. Don't do that if you can help it. So if you have the opportunity to walk away to where, yeah, you can buy it out for $20,000, but it's only worth $15,000, then don't buy it out. Don't trade it in. Just give it back to the leasing company and say, thank you very much. So that's why you might want to walk away from it. So with that being said, let's talk about some of the things you need to consider with a lease. So usually there's a mileage limitation. So the lower mileage leases are usually 10,000 miles per year. They have 12,000 miles per year, 15,000 miles per year. And then there's some options above that, but these are the most common leases that you'll see is a 10, 12, or 15 mile a year lease. So your 10,000 mile a year lease is going to cost less than the 12,000 mile a year lease, because actually what they're doing is they're structuring that you're not paying off as much of the car and this, that, and the other. So with that being said, those are usually your options. So what happens if you go over on the mileages? Well, typically there's some sort of a penalty if for every mile that you go over, and usually that penalty is somewhere in the ballpark of 25 cents. There's some leasing companies that's as low as 17 cents. And maybe even some lower than that. But usually you pay a per mileage overage. So if you go over, you're going to pay 25 cents a mile for every mile that you go over the lease. Now, some people freak out about this and they're like, oh my gosh, 25 cents a mile, what happens if I go way over on my lease? Well, if you're really concerned about that, then make sure you're in a lease where you can buy your vehicle out, because then you'll just want to, rather than walking away from it, you're going to want to buy it out and then sell it private party, or trade it in or something, rather than having to pay the leasing company if you're going to have an exorbitant amount of mileage overages. But generally it's like 25 cents per mile that you go over whatever the contractual lease agreement is. Now, some people are like, that seems like a ripoff to me. I have to pay to give the car back. In reality, it's not, because cars are depreciating assets, and the more miles you put on them, the more you depreciate the car. So what's the average depreciation? Now, these numbers might not be exactly accurate, but when I sold cars a few years ago, the average depreciation, so let's say that you've got a 3-year-old car and that the average market is that people in 3 years, they're putting 12,000 miles a year or 36,000 miles over the course of the 3 years. So most of those 3-year-old cars, they're coming through at 36,000 miles. But let's say that you have 50,000 miles on that. Well, they're going to take depreciation into effect much more harshly than they are that car that's got 37,000 miles, Like, that's going to be something that you need to consider. And typically the depreciation is more like 32 cents per mile, and that number is going to vary from vehicle make and model. But 32 cents a mile, typically you're taking a harder hit on depreciation than you would on a mileage overage. The difference is that they're just not going to, if you do a traditional finance and you put way too many miles on the car, they're going to give you 32 cents per mile less. This, you have to come out of pocket and pay 25 cents a mile more than whatever your lease payment was. So those are some things to consider. Now, the last thing that you want to consider and think about is the money factor. There's other things to consider too, but for what our purposes on this video today is the money factor. Now, your money factor is kind of like your interest rate on a traditional loan. So most loans at the time of this recording, if you're going to get a good rate, you're going to be, if you're under 3, that's like incredible. But most people are going to be paying 3-4% interest if you've got good credit, and then it obviously goes up from there. But I don't know of any banks that are really lending at less than, say, 3% interest. Well, there's a lot of leases out there where your money factor is basically less than 1% interest. It's like less than 1% money. And so that can be a great, great thing. If you can borrow someone else's money at 1%, that's a killer deal. And if you've got ways of making money, let's say that you've got a guaranteed way that you make, maybe you've got investments or savings or a business or something, and you can have, a 7% return on your money. This is, we've talked about in other videos, the principle of arbitrage. If it costs you 1% money, but you can make 7% and you get to keep the 6% difference, would that be a wise and prudent financial choice? Yes, it would. Yes, it would. So we would have these people when I was selling cars who would come in and they'd want to pay cash for a vehicle. Let's say they wanted to pay cash for an Escalade, for example. Say it's a $100,000 Escalade. They'd want to write us a check for $100,000. And we'd say, well, gosh, if you've got that kind of cash and that ability to just write a check, don't you have some investments that are making you better than, you probably have some investments where you're making 6, 7, 5, 6, 7%, 10%. Don't you have some investments that are doing better than that? And they'd say, well, yeah. I'd say, well, why don't you keep half of your money? Just do a lease. If you want to write us a check for it, then cool, write us a check for the amount of the lease, and keep half your money for 2 or 3 years for the duration of the lease. Let it be earning interest at your 7%. And then if you want to buy that car out, then give us the other half of the money and you can do it at that time. But at least you could have been earning that, that other $50,000 or, whatever the case may be, that can be earning money. Instead of you giving it and sinking it all back into the car, you can be borrowing money at 1%, making money at 7%, and you get to keep and take home 6%. So those are some of the considerations to make when you do a lease. Hopefully that's helpful and beneficial. Let me know in the comments if it is.